So when I was a student at Case Western Reserve in the late 70s, early 80s, my work became mainly about helping large bureaucratic organizations transform to collaborative new forms of organizing, team-based organization, that sort of stuff. I was working with David Kolb, who's one of my advisors, and we were designing the Employee Participation Groups program at General Motors at the time. And then I got a job with General Motors helping to sort of develop that through an 800,000 person organization. And at the time, General Motors was deeply into socio-technical redesign of manufacturing and developing cooperative labor management relationships. And I got really interested in how we design new forms of organizing that really support collaborative work. And for the next 10 years, that was what most of my work was about. And at the end of that 10 years, I became disenchanted with how many examples we had of really successful collaborative organizations that had reverted back to command and control in some way. And I became fascinated with why is that? Why is that happening? And at the same time, process reengineering was coming in and taking away most of the work for people like me, who at that time I was, redesigning organizations, but I was a one-person show. And all of a sudden, Price Waterhouse was showing up with 300 consultants, and they were going to redesign your organization. And I took a sabbatical from my university job and spent a year with a startup called Stentor in Canada, which was itself an interesting story of 600 people and a couple of $1 billion in a Presto organization that was a joint effort of the different telephone monopolies as the monopolies were being taken apart. And we had great people, and we had great resources, and we had a clear vision, and we had the right structure, and we had everything right, and it still didn't work. And it was during Stentor that I started to get an inkling of why that may not be working. And over the next 10 years, developed the model and technologies that became Clear Leadership. And the insight I had was that when we develop collaborative relationships and collaborative organizations, in order for them to be successful over time, they not only need to perform, they need to learn. And that was something I always understood about these new forms of collaborative organizing, that we were creating them because the command and control forms of organizing were really good for performing, but they were lousy for learning. And as the world speeded up, organizations needed to learn how to learn more effectively. And that the way of trying to do that was either to be a high-performing organization and lousy at learning, or to be a very adaptive, innovative organization but be very inefficient. And now we're in this place of trying to find a way to be both. And I think a lot of the attempts to create team-based forms of organizing and that are attempts to find a solution to that problem of how do we be efficient and productive and at the same time be adaptive and innovative. And anyway, what I realized was that when we try to learn collectively from our experience, what typically happens is people get together and they talk about what happened last week or last month to try to figure out what they thought was good and what wasn't good and what they would try to do differently in the future. And the problem with that is that everybody is having a different experience. And the reason everybody's having a different experience is because everybody creates their own experience. And I think that's so very obvious. 5 people sit in a meeting, and at the end of that meeting, if you ask those 5 people what happened, you'll get 5 different stories. I was once talking about this to a group of managers. They ran a bank in Australia, and one of them, pardoned himself to go, I think, to the washroom anyway. And we were sitting around talking some more, and the president said to the other executives who were there, "What do you think about these weekly State of the Union meetings we're now having at the branch, at head office?" And one of the managers said, "Oh, I don't think they're very good. I think people find them boring and not inspiring at all." And we were talking about that when the manager who had excused himself came back, and the president said, "Let's check out that different experience thing." And they said, "Murray, what do you think of these new State of the Union meetings?" And he said, "Oh, they're fantastic. Turning everybody on. People are having a great experience." And we all fell over laughing. But there it is, and so what seems to happen is when people get together to try to learn from their collective experience, the first problem is that everybody's had a different experience. And how people normally solve that problem is by deferring to the leader. Well, their experience is the right experience. But I think it's in that very moment when that happens that collaboration falls apart. Because as soon as I say to the leader, well, okay, your experience is the right experience, then I no longer feel responsible for what happens next. And I believe collaboration rests fundamentally on a partnership where everyone feels responsible for the success of whatever project or process we're engaged in. But in that moment, when I say, well, okay, boss, whatever you say, I back off and I now make the boss responsible for success. And I think that's the easiest move in the world, to make the boss responsible for success. And at that moment, I'm no longer feeling in a collaborative relationship, and I'm no longer feeling responsible for what happens, and that schism just gets wider and wider. And what's interesting to me is that it happens even though both parties want to be in a collaborative relationship. I have never talked to a manager who doesn't want the people who works for him and her to feel responsible for the success of whatever they're doing. And I haven't talked to anybody who doesn't want to work in an organization where their boss, their peers, their subordinates, their suppliers, whoever isn't working with them in a relationship where people feel equally responsible for success. So that led me onto this, taking a look at what was happening in the meetings I was sitting in with executive teams and noticing that people weren't really talking about their experience. And that led me to the second insight, which is that what's happening most of the time is that people don't talk to each other about their experience, and they don't talk about each other's experience. And if I'm having an experience of you that doesn't make sense to me and is in some way disturbing, unpleasant, whatever, I generally don't go and ask you about that. But yet I'm still compelled to make sense of you in some way, to try to understand, why am I having this experience of you? Now, most often I think what happens is, if I can't make sense of you, I go talk to a third person, perhaps my spouse, perhaps another colleague, someone where I try to figure you out. And I do that by making up a story about you that helps you make sense to me. And that sense-making process, I think, is going on all the time in organizations. And the result of that is that so often in organizational life, when people are interacting with each other, they're doing it based on stories they've made up about each other that they haven't checked out. And so I'll make decisions about what to say to you and what not to say to you, what things to include you in, what things not to include you in, how to approach you, and so on, based on the stories I've made up about you to make sense of you, stories that I haven't really checked out. And I call this condition interpersonal mush. And I think interpersonal mush is the key force for mediocrity in organizational life. And I believe it's the interpersonal mush that inevitably destroys partnership and collaboration. And that what's required are skills to clear out the mush. And one of the reasons for this is because, unfortunately, the stories we make up about each other tend to be more negative than the reality. And I think anybody who's worked in organizations for any period of time recognizes that if you leave a vacuum of information, the rumors that flood in to fill that vacuum are never nice stories. They're always the worst possible scenario. And I recognize this, and a lot of us recognize this, but I didn't really have an explanation for it until recently with the research that's been done on the neurobiology of the mind, and the recognition that each of us evolutionarily are ancestors of the most paranoid people, because the people who survived 10,000 years ago were the ones that whenever there was a little rustle in the bush, they would yell "tiger" and go running, and even if they were wrong 19 out of 20 times, the 1 out of 20 times they were right meant that they didn't get eaten, and so they're the ones who survived, and we are their progeny. And so our brains are organized to assume that any ambiguous signal is potentially dangerous, to make sense of things from a very cautious place, to in some ways anticipate the worst. And we take that into our sense making. And so what ends up happening over time is that the sense making that goes on in organizations becomes increasingly toxic and increasingly negative, and it feeds on itself. And the research that I and my students have done now for the past 15 years, we've concluded that about 4 out of 5 conflicts in organizations, and by conflicts I'm talking about relationships that aren't working, And I would say in your work life, 4 out of 5 relationships in your work life that aren't working are because of the interpersonal mush. They're not working because you and that other person or both of you have made up stories about each other to try to understand each other that are getting in the way of your ability to work together effectively in a collaborative relationship. So based on those 2 key insights, I then started working on, well, what are the assumptions and what are the skills that are required to create interpersonal clarity, to create a relationship where we're clearing out the mush and we're not operating toward each other based on stories we made up, but rather we are able to learn from our collective experience in an ongoing way that supports partnership and supports our relationships and makes it easier to know what's really going on. And that's how the clear leadership model evolved.